My name is Dudley Brown. I'm a grape grower and winemaker in McLaren Vale, South Australia. Please ignore the accent. It's Australian. I'm just a bit confused. In fact, I'm a lot confused. That's how I ended up speaking at TEDx. They actually invited me to share my confusion with you. Before I became a farmer, I was in recruiting for startups in California. As my business education was in wealth creation and not wealth redistribution, I was poorly prepared to understand the politics of agriculture in Australia. I moved to Australia in 2003, not long after I realized that my three biggest expenses in California were my mortgage, my property taxes, and my wine purchases. The idea was to raise my kids in a beautiful place and eliminate my three biggest expenses by buying a vineyard and drinking my own wine. What could possibly go wrong? I considered 3 wine regions in California and 5 in Australia. I hired a viticultural expert and researched grape and wine quality, soils, climate, and water before choosing McLaren Vale above all others. My plan was to eke out a living selling grapes and building a very small wine brand to support my family. After arriving, I worked as a laborer in the vineyard for 3 years, improving our so-so grapes into some of Australia's best using principles we now call sustainable farming. In 2005, the risk of water shortages resulting from the drought made me realize that I could be driven out of business and lose my life savings. Maine's water then cost about $900 per megaliter. It's now approaching $2,500 per megaliter, high enough to have put me out of business. The good news was that I had an alternative. There was a privately owned reclaimed water system nearby. The bad news was it would cost $100,000 just to connect to it. Reclaimed water irrigation has 2 advantages for the world. It increases the amount of drinking water available for people, and it reduces the amount of pollution that flows into the ocean. I helped start a small plan with small farmers to ask our governments to match our investments to substitute our irrigation source. Our approach was market-based. The government's investment would be about the same price as permanent water entitlements on the river at the time. The pollution we prevented was a bonus. We pitched state and federal parliamentarians on this, and they handed it off to the bureaucracy where it became a policy issue worthy of study, which means it went nowhere. In the lead up to the 2007 election, Anthony Albanese's advisor called me out of the blue one day and asked for a meeting with Anthony the following day. After the announcement that Labor supported our plan, a political bidding war broke out between the parties that resulted in $4 million worth of funding to support our plan. That's when I learned my first big idea. Politics matter more than policies. Policies don't change until politicians need to win an election. 4 years on, we've permanently substituted 500 million liters of drinking water, enough for 2,000 households per year, and we're only halfway finished. This little project initiated my unholy descent into the politics of agriculture in Australia. Now, hopefully you'll understand why I was very slow to catch on onto my big idea number 2, because it came as a serious shock to me and probably will be equally shocking to some of you. Wine is not food. Australia does not need more wine, it does need more food. These 2 big ideas inform my view of 3 policy areas that impact the wine and grape industry: water, tax, and land use. My confusion is local in nature, but has impacts nationally. As Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. The wine grape industry is in long-term oversupply. Approximately 1/3 of the wine grapes grown in Australia are not required by wineries. Because most grapes are substitutable from region to region, the effect is to drive down grape prices in all regions, regardless of quality. As a guy with pretty strong free market beliefs, I know that low prices drive out low quality and inefficient producers. But in Australia, strangely, they don't. In discussing this problem with those in government, their stock answer is always, "We don't pick winners." This led me to big idea number 3. Government policies pick winners, whether they do something new or not, and whether they mean to or not. The current taxation of wine in Australia is done on the basis of value of wine, not on the amount of ethanol it contains. The rest of the ethanol industry, beer, spirits, etc., is taxed volumetrically. The effect of the current tax policy is to make low-priced wine, particularly cask wine, the cheapest way to get drunk in Australia. Ethanol is dangerous and addictive. Those with the least money and the biggest thirst for ethanol logically buy cask wine. These folks need help, not cheap booze. The outcome of current policy can most visibly be seen scattered across the outback in the form of empty casks, ruined lives, and decimated communities, particularly Aboriginal ones. But the costs are spread across the entire population in the form of healthcare costs, broken families, crime, drunk driving deaths, and homelessness to the tune of many billions per year. While the wine industry doesn't have a monopoly on this problem, it insists on maintaining its tax-advantaged status as Australia's low-cost provider of ethanol. On the other hand, it asserts that wine's a hedonic product, that we drink it for its flavor and its alcoholic properties, and that overwhelmingly we do so responsibly, which is fair enough. But if this is truly the case, and wine actually tastes better than other forms of ethanol, what's the wine industry worried about? Competition? The second aspect of the current tax is the 31% wet rebate. The intent of this policy is to refund taxes paid by wine producers, by small wine producers who generally produce higher value wines, to compensate them for the excessive tax that they pay on the volume rate of tax. Yeah, I know. It's confusing. As growers have found winery buyers of grapes vanishing, they're increasingly lending their grapes to middlemen who offer the grower the proceeds from making their grapes into bulk wine and less the cost of production a few months later. What could go wrong? Crucially, the middleman then pockets the 31% wet rebate on the sale price. This money is earned with almost no capital invested and no risk, while people who've invested their lives in the vineyard just get even lower prices the next year because the surplus just got bigger. The net of this is that the taxpayers funding middlemen who have no capital at risk and grape growers with unviable businesses to make our very worst grapes to be sold around the world with Made in Australia stamped on every bottle for as little as 50 cents per liter. Which winner has government picked here? Do they even know? In 2011, it's believed that 900,000 tons of wine-worthy, which means disease-free grapes, were harvestable for table wine. Despite this, Australia processed over 1.6 million tons of grapes. This means as many as 45 million cases of truly awful wine was made and added to the oversupply. The only demand for bad fruit in 2011 was from rent-seeking middlemen who made common cause with desperate farmers to take taxpayers' money legally. Unintended consequences are called unintended for a reason. They're unintended. Is this the outcome the taxpayers intended? In the grape growing industry today, inland regions use 7 to 10 times more irrigation water to grow $1 worth of grapes than the coastal regions like Barossa or McLaren Vale. If you factor in reclaimed water, up to 25 times the amount of drinking water is required to grow $1 worth of grapes in inland regions compared to McLaren Vale. 20 years ago, McLaren Vale produced similar yields of grapes with similar amounts of irrigation to inland regions, but we realized we were destroying our aquifer in the process. To protect our long-term viability, we limited water extraction in the nation's first managed basin. The effects were that prices for McLaren Vale grapes rose as quality rose. Growers suddenly owned water rights worth $15,000 per megaliter, where before they were worth nothing. And our aquifers recharging, even in drought years. And the unfortunate outcome was that water restrictions wrecked our lower value almond growing industry. This step change in water management led me to the fourth big idea. The regulatory changes can be a good thing as long as they're applied broadly and equally. And there's a saying on the river that if you're downstream, you're dirty with everyone upstream. To understand inland water usage, up to 1,000 liters of river water are required to produce 1 liter of wine that sells for less than 1 liter of water in the UK or the USA. Confused yet? Here's a silly idea. Why don't we just cut out the wine grower and make some serious money selling 1,000 bottles of water? The peak bodies of wine, the wine industry, have defined the industry in terms of cool climate, coastal regions versus warm climate inland regions. But the consumer's smarter than the experts. They don't care about where it came from. They value price and quality. But if we extend the industry definition to serious analysis of data, what we discover is that the high-value coastal regions create 4.3 times as many jobs, as much economic value, and 5.5 times as many jobs per grape as low-value inland regions. Now, I want you to think like a business person for a minute. If you owned Australia, would want to invest your money in those that create more value, jobs, and trade from wine or less? Would you use your scarcest resource to grow food or unneeded wine? As it stands, SA Water is entitled to extract 200 gigaliters, that's 2 billion liters of water from the River Murray every year for Adelaide every year, for free. Even in drought years, Adelaide didn't need a lot more water than that because of local catchments. Now SA Water is building a 200 gigaliter desalination plant to drought-proof Adelaide for $1.8 billion plus operating costs in the hundreds of millions a year, whether the plant runs or not. On top of this, Australia's had to build new gas-fired generators to make up for the expensive green energy that they're firing the desal plant with. Most folks on the river think this is a pretty good idea. Instead of a desal plant, the government could have invested the same amount of money buying water licenses totaling 200 gigaliters from unprofitable grape growers in the Murray-Darling Basin by paying them above market rates of $2,500 per megaliter for their permanent water entitlements. Under this approach, these farmers would have been able to retire in dignity with their mortgages paid off or purchase annual water to grow food on their land. The entire national grape surplus of 500,000 tons of annual production could have been wiped out and the wine industry restored to profitability. Australia wouldn't have lost 1 calorie of food production, and Adelaide's needs would have been met in perpetuity. But here's the pointy bit. After buying all these rights, the government would have still had $1.3 billion left over. This is enough to build the new Royal Adelaide Hospital without Macquarie Bank's assistance. But governments would have had to pick a different winner. So whether you care about the wine industry, CO2 emissions, inland communities, the water supply, the health of the river, bankers' profits, better health care, or your tax dollars, this stuff actually matters. The truth is there's always been plenty of water in the river. We've just let the government allocate it very poorly. As Ronald Reagan once said, if you'd put the government in charge of Sahara Desert, we'd be out of sand in 5 years. Which led me to big idea number 5. Let the government do what it does best, collect taxes, and let the market do what it does best, allocate resources. For instance, what if we put a $50 per megaliter levy on all water extracted from the Murray-Darling Basin, put the money into a trust fund? Now, that seems like a lot of money, but remember we pay $2,500 a liter per megaliter in Adelaide. The government could then hold auctions where water rights holders tendered their entitlements in an auction, so we could buy back the water at the most efficient price until permanent environmental flows are established on the river. The levy would drive out the most inefficient and unprofitable water users for the most efficient price, while those who stayed on the land would have permanent supply and incentives to invest in efficiency and quality. The caveat to this would be for like flood-based crops, where rice and cotton, we could give them free water in flood years, let them have it. And because water would be in the river all the time, floods would be more frequent and more water available for annual purchases. This approach offers pain and gain for everybody. Everyone would have an equal incentive to be more efficient while guaranteeing Australia's long-term food supply and the health of the river. Now, the reactions to this sort of thing are completely predictable. We'll bankrupt farmers, we'll destroy communities, and we don't pick winners. The short answer is that we'll get these outcomes anyhow, just more slowly, less rationally, and with worse outcomes for taxpayers, the agricultural industry, and the environment. In Australia, the best regions for agriculture are mostly near the coast because that's where most of the rain is. It's also the best place to dig mines and drill for gas because of access to transportation. Unfortunately, it's where 90% of us live. Our best land and food security is being sacrificed for housing estates and mining because the government is usually the owner of the land and needs the money to fund infrastructure for bigger cities and mines. They also earn stamp duties and royalties, which they use to spend on infrastructure for bigger cities and mines. Does anybody see a pattern here? In McLaren Vale, the Labour government just sold land for a 1,000-house estate on some of the best cropping and viticultural land in the world, despite local opposition. An adjoining property sells grapes that end up in wine that sells for $250 a liter, 500 times the price of the direct being produced by our rent-seeking middlemen. The new housing estate will be on land classified as low value because the government only share farm grain on it. The fact is that if agricultural land isn't valuable and in highly valued use, it gets used for housing. The only serious solution is to embrace denser, smarter cities where the best agricultural land is ring-fenced in perpetuity from urban sprawl. Having lived in California, I've got to see the best and the worst options here. There's Los Angeles. This all used to be agricultural land. Or Napa Valley, where it's still agricultural land. In McLaren Vale, agriculture land has risen 20 times in value in the last 40 years. We've prodded the current government to embrace a long-term strategy to protect our best land after a 5-year campaign. It isn't law yet. It's a big idea we stole from the Napa, where agricultural land has increased in value by 300 times in 40 years under a similar model. The nexus of interest between Treasury departments, developers, engineers, construction companies, miners, unions, and planning departments may be just too strong to stop all this. Maybe. Which leads me back to revised big idea number 1. Gets a little red card there. Politics matter, but politics and politicians could matter a lot more if we make our big ideas political ideas. TEDx is a brilliant forum to air the big ideas that governments find unthinkable. Taxing alcohol rationally, building denser cities, ending the dream of endless sprawl, putting levies on irrigation water, spending the proceeds to future-proof our water and food supplies, protecting people without means from too cheap ethanol, picking real winners, whatever. This will only work if you leave TEDx today and start thinking the unthinkable, saying things your neighbors won't agree with, calling your MP every week. Ask mine, I call them at least 3 times a week, sometimes 3 times a day. Building new kinds of community groups, blogging, writing, talking, and generally upsetting people. This also means bypassing traditional industry and policy structures. Politicians, not bureaucrats, need to know that they need to change policies or they will be changed at the next election. Voting for the party you've always voted for ensures that you keep getting the same crappy results because of big idea number 6. Politicians take you for granted and your silence for permission. The truth is that you do own this country. You are the person who can turn big ideas into political ideas. Politicians and bureaucrats are your employees. It's your job to make clear what you want and to keep big ideas in the air and on the table. It's no fun figuring out whom to upset every day, but neither is running out of great land, clean water, healthy food, or good wine. Now that would be a disaster. Thank you.